Hi, good morning. It's Barbara Berrigan-Perea with Tim Stroshane and Mariah Looney at the controls this morning, and welcome to our webinar, Taking the Delta Watershed's Pulse. We're so glad people are joining us as we explain how flow is tracked in the Delta. We have listeners today from Fish and Wildlife, California Water Boards, and Aqua, and we welcome you and we're glad that you joined us. I'm going to give you a quick update on two items, three items maybe. First off, our webinar series is going to continue, we think, into many months to come and maybe just become a permanent tool. It's really great for organizing around the state. We always intended to do it, and now we've been forced to by necessity. And we will generally run webinars on topics of interest to the Delta. We think between like the 21st and 22nd of every month through the 25th somewhere. So you just keep looking for the notices of topics. And in fact, it'd be great to hear from some of our followers. What do you want to learn about the Delta that you don't know? We're pretty good at communicating. We've shared a lot of information over the years. But we kind of think it would be fun to hear from you what you really want to hear and what you want to learn about. Two other things that have happened since last month. Restore the Delta has been a party to filing two lawsuits. The first one was filed against Department of Water Resources with several other partners. And that lawsuit is based around the long-term operations of the State Water Project and really deals with the fact that no true impacts were found in their environmental document. Our second lawsuit this week, which was filed against the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, Secretary of Interior Bernhardt, really deals with the conversion of contracts for Central Valley project contractors to a permanent status. If you take a look at our filing, our problem was that NEPA analysis really wasn't done the way it should be. And that brings us to a common thread with both lawsuits. And that is, there is this idea that impacts don't exist from water exports and no mitigation is required. And so we're just going to keep on this track of having to fight where we need to going forward. Litigation is a form of collaboration, and we want to make sure that proper mitigations happen for the Delta with water exports, and that we really manage the Delta's water flows, watershed, and water exports in a sustainable way. It is the only hope we have, I think, of any type of recovery. Tied to all of this is our plea. We keep doing our work at Restore the Delta, but we did lose a major fundraiser, and we are struggling just like everyone else, and we know everybody is struggling, but we really are calling on members. If everyone gave us a $25 or a $50 check, we'd be able to pull through with other funding sources that we've been working on. With that said, I would like to turn over the workshop in today's lesson to Tim Stroshane, our policy analyst extraordinaire. And feel free to get your questions in. You can type them in. I think Mariah will be reading questions at the end for answer. And we hope you're all well and safe, and stay home, wash your hands, and continue on toward good things.
Okay, welcome to Restore the Delta's third webinar of 2020. Today we'll cover Taking the Delta Watershed's Pulse. I'm Tim Stroshane, as Barbara said, policy analyst with Restore the Delta. If you want links to the actual online sources that I described, please feel free to download the webinar notes that accompany this presentation. Today's event is not for modelers, even though we at RTD consume and evaluate models all the time. We decided to put on this webinar topic because RTD is interested in whether models about the Delta and its watershed are useful and reasonable. We get a new document from a water agency or regulator, so we turn the key kick the tires, and open and shut its doors to see how useful the bottle is. We do this because our advocacy has to be as fact-based as possible. We do this also because while some things are measured in the Delta watershed, other measurable things are not. The relevance of facts can open a door in public debate, revealing both the power of reality and the reality of power as they confront each other. To us, that is one place where Delta water struggles get interesting. Okay, here's today's outline. After a brief introduction, we'll look at water project operations and regulation, endangered fish, estuary beneficial uses, flood control, and drought monitoring. I'll summarize who uses what sorts of data and why. The latter half of my presentation will take up two case studies. One about a highly measured and accounted system of coordinated operations of our state's two largest water projects, and the other about subsistence fishing in the Delta, an important activity that is hardly measured at all. Your next career as a water data nerd can begin when this presentation ends. When a doctor or nurse takes your pulse, they measure your heart rate. They want to help you manage your health. The measurement of water, other chemicals, and creatures that live in Delta waters is pulse taking because of the adage, you cannot manage what you don't measure. Unless you have key facts about resources you hope to use, exploit, harvest, manage, you won't have a prayer of being a good steward. You need access to and interest in data and its analysis to answer questions like, how much is enough? Who gets how much of the resource and when? What is the most efficient way to allocate this resource to those who want it? How do we know we're doing the right thing at the right time? If we know stuff, are we willing to take action based on that knowledge? If we don't know stuff, are we willing to invest in data collection and scientific analysis to learn more? You can see how these questions come up repeatedly in rationales for taking the Delta watershed's pulse. This on this slide is not an exhaustive list, but first on it is water project operations and allocations. Second is the regulation of water project operations to make sure they comply with their water rights permits. Third is to monitor when flood warnings may be needed in connection with weather reports. Fourth, monitoring whether drought conditions are setting in. California's coordinated water systems, the Federal Central Valley Project, or CVP, and the State Water Project, or SWP, have led to grave ecological and water quality problems. They include endangering fish species and impairment of other beneficial uses in the Bay Delta estuary. These problems have required that additional data collection and monitoring studies be undertaken to help state and federal agencies manage problems created by water resource development. Operations refers to how the dams and reservoirs, pipelines, aqueducts, canals, hydropower generating plants, pumping plants, even treatment plants function individually and together to store, convey, and deliver safe and reliable supplies of fresh water for human use. Allocations are the apportioning of supplies to project customers for their eventual use. The Bureau of Reclamation operates the CVP to collect, store, and allocate water to its contractors and customers. California Department of Water Resources, or DWR, operates the SWP in a similar way. Measurement for water project operation begins with snowpack. Snow may look beautiful or be the occasion for building a snowman or making and throwing snowballs. But snowpack means something else to hydrologists working, for example, for the State Water Project. Water measured in snowpack can be thought of as frozen runoff. It is water in nature's bank, so to speak. That storage is free to society. By looking at the snow water content of samples of snow, water managers can make projections of how much surface water will eventually run off to the rivers and streams below. There is an extensive snowpack monitoring system in the Sierra Nevada that the state relies on to estimate how much water is actually stored as snow. Once the snow actually melts, it runs off to adjacent rivers and streams. There, it is measured as runoff using flow gauges at specific locations. Flow gauges are also placed at the upstream ends of reservoirs, at mouths of pipes that pass through dams to release water from storage, at key diversion points or pumping plants, and along canals or pipelines where water gets delivered to a customer. A great deal of effort and technology goes into forecasting water supplies from snowpack and runoff data during the early months of each calendar year. These months coincide with the end of winter and the beginning of spring when snowmelt starts. These forecasts are crucial for how the water projects will actually allocate water to their customers. Let's move now to how data relates to allocation of water supplies. Federal Central Valley Project customers are often referred to as CVP contractors. The CVP has 300 contractors whose total contract quantities claim 9.5 million acre-feet. An acre-foot is about 326,000 gallons. About 57% of these contracted claims occur south of the Delta, including Westlands Water District with a contract for up to 1.15 million acre-feet annually. While there are a handful of small Central Valley towns who are CVP contractors, most are agricultural water districts whose direct water users are farmers irrigating crops. Their rural tax bases are fairly small, so U.S. taxpayers subsidize all CVP operations to a significant degree. The SWP has 29 direct customers called state water contractors, and their contracts also specify the maximum amount of water supply they can claim annually while their contract is in effect. That total amount, which is also called Table A, is about 4.17 million acre-feet claimed. Like the CVP, most of SWP demand lies south of the Delta. The ratepayers of SWP contractors may also pay property taxes to support the financing of the state water project. There are no U.S. taxpayer subsidies for SWP operations. Based on runoff projections, allocations are made by DWR for the SWP and the Bureau for the CVP. They are expressed as a percentage of their contractors' contract amounts. For example, this year, DWR and Bureau South of Delta agricultural contractors were each allocated 15% of their contract amounts, though the other day, the Bureau increased this allocation to 20%. Let's turn now to water regulation. The key regulatory documents for Bay Delta watershed conditions, is the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. It's updated and implemented by the State Water Board. It depends on monitoring vital signs of river flows, chemical concentrations, particularly salt, and operational actions subject to board oversight. The plan lays out a calendar of what conditions or operational actions are supposed to be occurring at a specific time of year so that beneficial uses in the estuary are protected. There are three components to a water quality control plan: beneficial uses, water quality objectives that are to protect the beneficial uses, and a program of implementation. Water quality objectives are especially important because the levels at which they are set dictate how much fresh river inflow and delta outflow are put toward protecting in delta beneficial uses as compared with how much of those flows can be exported to CBP and SWP customers beyond the Delta. The consequences of the Delta's troubled waters include listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act of 4 different native fish species: Delta smelt, Central Valley steelhead trout, and 2 runs of Chinook salmon, the winter and spring runs. As Delta exports and upstream reservoir operations continued to increase in the early 2000s, scientists observed that by 2005, these same fish species and other species as well were experiencing dramatic declines, including of those species that reside year-round in the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary. They called this ecosystem collapse the pelagic organism decline. Pelagic simply means open water, and the decline refers to the fact that so many species residing in Delta open waters were dying off. Vital flow indicators used by water regulators and project operators to protect Delta fish include whether the Delta cross-channel gates are open or closed near Walnut Grove. When open years ago, the DCC would let migrating salmon and steelhead, young salmon and steelhead, enter the central Delta where they faced higher risk of death from predators. By authority of the State Water Board since about 1995, when fish are present, the DCC gates are closed. Delta inflow is another vital sign. It comes from the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and East Side tributaries, which include the Cosumnes, McKellamne, and Calaveras rivers. Delta outflow to the heart of the estuary and San Francisco Bay is another vital sign. Delta exports to state and federal water contractors south of the Delta are part of yet another vital sign called the ratio of exports to inflow, or E/I ratio, which describes the share of inflow that is devoted solely to exports. Depending on the time of year, exports may legally vary between 35 and 65% of inflow. Scientists figured out about 30 years ago that the bigger the low salinity zone in the western Delta, the better for the estuary. The size of the estuary in both its depth and its breadth is approximated by measuring something called X2. X2 is located at the sweet spot of the low salinity zone in the estuary. It is expressed as a distance upstream from the Golden Gate. The estuary is at its largest between about 60 to 74 kilometers, or about 37 to 46 miles from the Golden Gate. This puts the sweet spot roughly between Grizzly Bay and Chips Island. When it goes above 74 kilometers, it means that the low salinity zone gets smaller. At that distance from the Golden Gate, the low salinity zone is confined to channels of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers upstream of their confluence near the city of Pittsburgh, instead of the wide open spaces of Suisun Bay. Put too little fresh water into this estuary, and the salt will push the fresh water upstream more and shrink the habitat for species that depend on that low salinity sweet spot. Passage of the 2009 Delta Reform Act called for the State Water Board to lead an informational proceeding about what flows fish need to recover their populations in the Delta and its larger watershed. Hearings were held in March 2010, and testimony was taken from scientists and lay people alike. Afterward, the Water Board found that recovery of fish populations to historic levels would take significantly more flow than was allowed fish at present. More flows overall would generally improve the ecological conditions of the estuary by keeping it larger, not just for fish, but for many of its various food webs on which endangered and other fish rely. The connection with data here is that by holding the proceeding, a large archive of scientific studies was amassed on which testimony and ultimately the board's determinations were based. And you can see the webinar notes for more details and links on that. Let's briefly revisit snowpack and runoff for another purpose of data collection: flood control. Obviously, it is important to measure snowpack to gauge runoff potential because if there is a lot of snow water content, its melting will generate a lot of runoff. And if a warm rainstorm arrives, it causes snow to melt rapidly. It's vitally important for public safety during flood seasons to know whether and when to sound the alarm for evacuation and other kinds of flood-related emergency responses. Snowpack and runoff are also important to detecting the onset of droughts. The map on this slide shows how drought covered most of California by September 2014. For most of us, drought means the absence of rain, the need to conserve water at home, in our communities, perhaps the rationing of water, and increased water rates. Drought measurement is important to water regulators because they have to use runoff data to decide when to curtail water diversions of junior water rights holders. And water users want to know what's going into that decision as well. Finally, scientists, water agencies, and fire departments know that drought can also be measured as reduced soil moisture. When soils dry out, plants die. Fire danger rises, and wildfire response requires advanced preparation and timely warning. While we have heard warnings of drought coming this year, this map shows we are in a much better position compared with 2014. The fact we can make this comparison shows value in having measured various indicators of drought. The State Water Board has authority to enforce water rights during droughts. Water right holders with more recent permits to divert and store water have in their permits something called Term 91. This puts them on notice that if their permit was issued during or after 1965, their water right could be curtailed when runoff is low until such time as sufficient runoff returns. Others whose rights are older than 1965 would still be able to divert in that situation. But when runoff gets particularly low, the State Board has authority to move that priority date for curtailment earlier. So that's an introduction to the role of data sources and uses in water management. With the two case studies to come, I wish to dig a little deeper and apply some of what I've presented. The following case studies describe how the adage, "you can't manage what you don't measure," can play out in reality. These cases suggest corollaries to the adage that I will offer. Planning and construction of both the CVP and SWP had very long lead times, generally 40 to 50 years from conception to completion, and I provide more detail in the webinar notes that you can download. Throughout the 1950s, state and federal engineers worked on operations studies, which we today call modeling, to figure out just how their two huge coordinated water systems could operate without causing litigation in the midst of hundreds of pre-existing senior water right holders, few of whom were sympathetic to having these two large water projects on their river systems. Building on those and other operation studies, the Coordinated Operation Agreement, or COA, provides CVP and SWP contractors with a conflict prevention and resolution process. Through it, they trust but verify each other's water diversions, storage, and releases, benefiting their customers, using an ongoing continuous process of measurement for the manipulation of water. Using the COA, the two projects dominate, if not outright control, Central Valley rivers and streams of the Delta watershed. One expression of excess conditions in the Delta watershed is an inequality, and the other describing balanced conditions is an equation. Basically, these expressions are economic. They connect supply with demand. The measurements going into them help determine which expression applies to govern operations and allocations. As important, the Bureau and DWR must determine from data whether they agree on whether the Delta watershed is balanced or in excess conditions. Operations and allocations follow from that determination. Upstream reservoir releases shown in that previous pair of expressions are simply the sum of releases of water from 4 large northern reservoirs in the CVP and SWP: Trinity, Shasta, Folsom, and Oroville. This is water that both DWR and the Bureau believe are their property and that no one else is supposed to mess with it. But then this is also why flows are measured for accounting purposes. Unregulated flows are COA lingo for unappropriated water, sometimes referred to as surplus water or unstored flow. This is water that has not been legally appropriated by anyone else. DWR and the Bureau believe that their water rights authorize them to scoop up as much unregulated flow as they have capacity to store for eventual export and delivery. Such water is easier to come by in wetter years. Unregulated flows are the wild card, the key variable in both of the COA expressions, especially when excess conditions apply. Because their water rights permits claim almost double the average flow of the Sacramento River Basin, the Bureau and DWR believe they have a right not only to divert as much surplus water as they can, but also to build more reservoirs to store and canals to convey that water to their customers. Sacramento Valley in-basin uses represent developed water demand north of the Delta, while exports represent developed water demand south of the Delta. Exports are measured at and delivered from the 2 major South Delta pumping plants, Banks and Jones. A third Delta diversion, that of Contra Costa Water District, a CVP contractor, is by far the smallest export diversion of the 3. A 1971 description of an earlier COA applies here as well. It stated, each agency regards its water as valuable property to be retained and controlled, but the water at one project is physically indistinguishable from that of another when they are mingled. This COA is needed to assure that each project obtains its equitable share of available water and bears its share of obligations to protect the water-related environment and support other forms of benefit. DWR and the Bureau single-mindedly pursue the property-protecting logic of their water rights and COA. They maximize their storage for and exports to customers above all else, even as they are required by regulators to balance this objective with meeting Delta water quality criteria. In the COA, they agree to collaborate because they can each achieve their prime objectives better by working together than they can pursuing them separately. Zealous harboring of their water rights notwithstanding, the California Constitution and the state water code declare that all water is the property of the people of this state, and that private entities may acquire rights to use water under the laws governing how it is to be appropriated. Thus, by law, water rights must be accountable to the public. In the fall of 2018, a COA addendum was negotiated between the Bureau and DWR. The Bureau took a hard line, having been authorized by then Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke to maximize water supplies to the CVP, and they made significant changes to COA arrangements. The COA addendum adjusts the shared responsibility between the two projects so that the Bureau and its CVP will have less responsibility in dry and critical years than it used to. That way, more of its supplies can go to its south of Delta customers during droughts, like Westland's Water District. This also means that in dry years, there will be much less water available to state water project customers. In the case of the COA addendum, then, a corollary to our introductory adage might read, if you don't like how the system is managed, change the parameters by which you measure and apportion responsibility. Many fish which are caught and consumed by subsistence anglers in the Delta eat their prey from the bottom of river channels where contaminants can accumulate. In the course of consuming prey, Delta fish may accumulate contaminants in their bodies like mercury, pesticides, selenium, and other chemicals from prey tissues. Consequently, subsistence anglers from environmental justice communities are at risk of heightened exposure to environmental contaminants associated with consuming Delta fish. Many of these contaminants are regulated by the State Water Board and the Central Valley Regional Water Board, and studied by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, whose staff scientists are well aware of such issues and post warnings in several languages to the public as warranted. In addition, many fish may be vulnerable. I seem to be behind. There we go. In addition, many fish may be vulnerable to disease and death from exposure to toxins released by harmful algal blooms, such as microcystin, which is a hepatotoxin, which is toxic to liver tissue and skin, which is produced by microcystis, a common cyanobacterium found in the Delta since 1999. Key factors believed by scientists to drive the formation of harmful algal blooms include water temperature, intense sunlight hitting water, water clarity, a stratified water column coupled with long residence times of water, availability of nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients, and salinity. Two of these factors would be directly affected by operation of a tunnel project: residence time of water and salinity. Increased residence time of water decreases flushing of cyanobacteria from a water body. The slower the flow of water, the more the upper levels of a water column can warm to an optimal growth temperature range for many cyanobacteria, which is generally between 77 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Such conditions may occur mainly in late summer months, but climate change effects may shorten California's wet season and contribute to extending the season during which harmful algal blooms may occur. Operation of a tunnel project would also increase residence time of water in the Delta. When this is combined with reduced flows and increased salinity from a tunnel's operations, environmental conditions favoring such algal blooms could increase. Subsistence fishing provides a diverse, affordable, and satisfying protein source for low-income households and communities of color, for whom fishing may be a necessary or traditional practice. Fish are food, and people should be able to catch them to nourish their families with little fear of toxic contamination. In fact, subsistence fishing is vital to the cultural survival of many Northern California Indian tribes who struggle to protect salmon, partnering with the state's commercial fishing industry and environmental water activists. At least subsistence fishing and tribal subsistence fishing are now recognized by the State Water Board as beneficial uses of water, deserving of water quality regulatory protection. But these beneficial uses have not yet been placed into the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. This non-market, non-commodified access to fish as food, unmediated by a money exchange, gives the lie to media tropes that water battles in California are about fish versus food, as if agriculture was the only source of food for human beings. It is obviously not. This trope is intended by its users to distort reality, to render invisible the reliance of environmental justice communities on subsistence fishing. We challenge this trope by advocating for strong protections for good water quality to protect this kind of fishing. In conclusion, this case study yields a further corollary to the management measurement adage. If you don't want to manage to benefit all members of our community equitably and justly, don't measure it. That's all I have today. Thanks for attending the webinar, and we'll be glad to take your questions now.
So we don't have any questions yet, but if people would like to ask them, they can put them in the questions tab, and I can go ahead and read them, and either Tim or Barbara can answer. So we can give a few minutes for people to do. Also, while people are doing that, in the chat box, I have added that people can download the handouts, including this presentation, and also Tim's notes. They're in the handouts tab and they can be downloaded there. Or you can go to the link provided in the chat box, restorethedelta.org/webinar-archive. And that has all of the documents as well as past webinars and documents. And the video from this webinar will be posted there as well. We have been recording. Okay, so it looks like we do have a question. Shira Cohen asks, can you explain in fairly simple terms how the delta conveyance would increase delta salinity and water residence time?
Sure. Let me put a map up, and that might facilitate this. Yeah, this map shows the potential alignment, and you can see in the upper or north part of the delta where there's some sort of a teal color in the graphic. There are 3 little dots, and those are diversion points for the tunnel. Potential intakes, it says in the legend, and they are located at Clarksburg, Hood, and Cortland. And the configuration of these North Delta intakes is very similar, if not identical, to what was contemplated for the California Water Fix project a couple of years ago. Okay, so those diversions would take good quality, fresh Sacramento River water upstream generally of where it would come into contact with tidal salty water in the delta. And that fresher water gets taken out of the delta at one or all 3 of these intakes and put into the tunnel for delivery to the south at Clifton Court Forebay pumping plants. So the removal of that fresh water from the Sacramento River at that point in the north means that there's going to be less fresh water flowing into the delta, into the rest of the delta. And that means that tidal salt water will be able to push further upstream into the delta without any countervailing push back by fresher water, by stronger flows of fresh water into the delta inflow from the Sacramento side of the delta. And that means that that tidal salt water is going to get to linger longer, hence the term increased residence time. That water from the tides has a chance to reside longer in the channels of the central and north delta if Sacramento River flows are removed. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that, Tim. She also asks if you can explain whether moving the intake up, as proposed with the Delta Conveyance Project, would affect in-stream flows above the intake.
Yes, it would. For a similar, if not identical reason, it would, if you move the intakes, if you move the intakes further north towards Sacramento, then yes, you would be interfering with the in-stream flow regime in that area, say up by Freeport and Clarksburg. And perhaps I'm a little concerned I'm misinterpreting the question, but the intakes at the Delta, at the North Delta diversions would generally also be accompanied by regulations. And these regulations were somewhat controversial for the water fix, but they would be accompanied by what are called bypass flows. And those would be water that was not diverted, sort of a minimum flow level that would be required, that DWR would have to allow to pass those intakes in the North Delta. And I hope that gets at an answer to the question and that I heard the question right.
Thank you for answering that.
Okay.
Anna Swenson says, and then asks, the river is very low right now in North Delta, lower than normal at this time of year. Now they are opening the gates at lock. Is that because there is no risk to fish at this time of year? Very concerned about low flows in hyacinth. Also, does spraying Roundup on it do anything?
I missed that last part, Mariah. It's the spring Roundup what?
The spraying Roundup on it.
Okay.
Oh, right.
Spraying around, it's the pesticide. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you about the Roundup spraying, but as far as the river being low, it is true. As my understanding is that runoff to the reservoirs from this past winter, and even the precipitation we had earlier this month is low, and that the storage is not going to be terribly robust this year. So it sounds, that implies to me that they would be withholding releases until farmers, especially in the San Joaquin Valley, are needing inputs of water. They may have some source, the farmers in the San Joaquin Valley right now may have, so I haven't checked on this, but this is a hypothesis that I'm about to put out, and that is perhaps they have sufficient supplies for their early irrigation regimen for their crops located at San Luis Reservoir. San Luis is a reservoir in the western San Joaquin Valley that's just west of the community of Gustine and the highway rest stop of Santanella, for those who know the area. And San Luis is a pretty large reservoir. It stores both state and federal water, and that reservoir may well have quite a bit of water in it for these early season irrigation applications for farmers. They may not be releasing water yet from, or much water yet from the upstream reservoirs in both systems until perhaps later in the year.
So to add on to that, Anna, there are studies and papers that have been published that the chemicals in Roundup can aggravate HABs. So it's going to be important for the North Delta community to keep their eye out on water conditions, because if you have lower flow, we've had a warm May, sunshine, and you have, of course, nitrates from agriculture that come downstream, and from wastewater treatments. You have reduced flows in some creeks in some areas. The HAB formations can start early. And the first one was reported in Yolo County, I believe, last week, adjacent to the Delta. So those are the impacts. The question of physically seeing less water moving could set the stage for conditions changing rapidly with HABs. So you may be watching it as closely at your end of the delta this year as we are at our end.
Thank you for that. Lindsay Hutchinson asks, with decrease in freshwater hydraulic pressure, how far north has brackish water moved past Sherman Island since 1985?
How far is that the question?
Yes, with decrease in freshwater hydraulic pressure, how far north has brackish water moved?
I haven't looked recently at the historical record, but this past drought sequence of drought years, 2012 through about 2016, there were some very serious encroachments of X2 well into the channels of the delta because reservoir releases were so low, and X2 threatened to move very far into the delta. And what DWR did to address that issue is to, I believe it was in June of 2015, they constructed a temporary barrier across False River. False River, I don't have a pointer, unfortunately. I'm not technically astute enough with the software we're using here, but False River is generally the small river that's between Jersey Island and Bradford Island in the West Delta. If you know Sherman Island and I think Brannan Island, Bradford is just it's the last big sort of curves in the San Joaquin River that comes around the south end of Sherman, and Jersey is across from Sherman at that point, across the San Joaquin. False River goes between Jersey and Bradford, and DWR planned and constructed a large rock barrier that stood there for, I think, into the late fall of 2015. So it was there for about 5 or 6 months, I think. And that barrier blocked the passage of salt water into the central delta and limited the encroachment of X2 into the delta. But at that point, let me go back to the kilometer map and we can figure out the kilometers from that little tortured description I just gave you. Hold on. Choose this one and put it up on the screen. And so that would be right about at Antioch. In fact, it's almost, in fact, False River, if you look at where the line from 100 kilometers dangles down into the delta, in the western delta, and it actually crosses the mouth of False River and touches Jersey Island. I should have put this map up in the first place. So False River is that river that flows from right to left into the San Joaquin. And so they built that barrier across False River, and that blocked some of the water that would have entered into the delta at that point. So it was about 100 kilometers from the Golden Gate at that point. That's about where the salt conditions were bad in 2015.
I would also add that it was in early spring of 2015. I believe that they were either in training sardines or anchovies at the pumps.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And of course, sardines and anchovies are more of an ocean fish than a bait fish. And so that reflects the favorable salinity conditions that could attract those fish further inland.
Awesome. So I have another question on salinity from Lawrence Danos. he asked, how different is the salinity today as opposed to roughly 20 years ago?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's not a question I've studied, but I would, let me think about that for a moment. There have been, I'd say that it's probably similar to the conditions 20 years ago. What's occurred largely in, and Barbara, feel free to jump in on this too, but my own sense is that what we've seen ever since the adoption of the 1995 Water Quality Control Plan is a sustained regime of very similar water quality regulations, including the water right decision that implements that plan, which is called Decision 1641. And there have been, they're just not coming to mind. I'm not thinking of any amendments to that plan. So really, it's been about the last 20 years since 2000 when D 1641 went into effect, and about 2005 when DWR and the Bureau were assigned official responsibility to start protecting Delta water quality objectives and providing flows for that purpose into the Delta. So it's clear, though, that since Delta smelt is going extinct and other species are continuing to struggle, like longfin smelt and Chinook salmon runs, these regulations are not really turning the corner for the benefit of those species. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
I would just say that, we hear the anecdotal stories all the time at Restore the Delta. Last week we had a sea lion removed from Stockton. So something is changing. This is where the hard work always is for Restore the Delta. We get told stories, we observe things, but we don't necessarily report that is a given fact. We always like to go back and look at the data. And we always like to measure up if what we're told or what we're observing is something that can be measured or tracked, and see how things match up. There are changes that people perceive. There are changes that I perceive. But I don't think all the data is there, maybe to really register it at the level it needs to be registered at. We are on the verge, we're just waiting for some funding to come in, of launching a water quality testing program with citizen science, with students. And that will be one of many things that we will be measuring as we go about tracking the development of harmful algal blooms.
I had one additional thought as what Barbara was referring to, and that is that she was mentioning how, we haven't seen studies done about, what the evaluating the efficacy of the regulations that we have in place, and that's true. I've made comments to both the State Water Board and the Delta Stewardship Council to that effect, that there needs to be a comprehensive evaluation of what's working and what's not, and why, and research into why whatever is not working is not working. So again, it's all about what you measure. It's also about what you go back and look and see, how are we doing? A lot of people in common daily practice in life want to know, well, how am I doing? And a lot of the regulatory agencies are pretty good at having studies done, and but they don't necessarily, they tend to be surveys, and they tend to not look back at what the history of their practice has been, and from when they start a new regulatory regime. And so it's a problem. gets back to that, are we doing the right thing? Do we need to do more? Do we need more information?
Awesome, thanks for that answer. I have another salinity question from Kim Dessenberg.
I want to add one other. I just want to add one other quick point. There have been reports. There was a media report done on a blog about really poor water quality conditions. I think related to salinity around South Delta agriculture, and that's another way to perceive what is actually happening. Their crop conditions, their growing conditions, and their struggles. So it's part observation by the general public and recreation, but a lot of that gets studied by South Delta because they're so dependent on that, on water quality for irrigating their crops.
Awesome. Okay, so Kim Dessenberg's question, it is, please review the location that the salinity sweet spot travels through in wet, dry, and normal years. Is this a simple gauge of the Delta water quality?
It's less a simple gauge of water quality than it is intended to be a gauge of where, as I've called it, the sweet spot, or the most productive ecotone, for those who know some ecological jargon, where the most productive and biodiverse ecotone is within the Delta. X2 is intended to, the adjustment and manipulation of X2 by flow, by application of flow to the Delta, is intended to benefit estuary beneficial uses. There are other water quality objectives in the Bay Delta Plan that deal with, for example, drinking water quality and limit the concentration of salts that must be adhered to for drinking water quality purposes. So I think the board thinks of it this way. I think I kind of agree with it that there are different purposes for different measurements of salinity. Now, X2, it's also important to realize, is a much more saline concentration of water quality. It's saltier than would be allowed at a drinking water diversion, say at Rock Slough for Contra Costa Water District, which is a water quality, has a water quality objective all its own in the Bay Delta Plan. So there are different standards for different purposes within the Delta.
Gotcha. We have 2 more questions, so this is just an opportunity to give anybody the chance to get theirs in before we wrap up. Michael Moran asks, how many people are sustenance fishers in the Delta, and how much sustenance do they get? And how much sustenance, he asked, maybe meals per week?
That's a great question. I don't know. And that was part of the point of having that case study. We don't know exactly how many people, or even roughly. We did the portion of my case study where I talked about what we did for the State Water Board's California Water Fix proceeding was an attempt to indicate what the size of this population of subsistence anglers might actually be, and it's not insubstantial. And we don't know a lot about what they catch or when they catch it. We don't know a lot of things, and we don't know if they're through maybe not quantitative studies, but through maybe ethnographic studies. What are the fish that they're catching used in? Are they used in community events? Are they just used for serving dinner at home that evening, or what? So there's a lot that the protection of this beneficial use needs from the standpoint of providing some information and analysis to support that beneficial use.
I would add that when we published our environmental justice report and went back and looked at the data from the survey that we created for the water board testimony that Tim had worked on. Fraser Schilling did contact us from UC Davis, and he said that our numbers matched his work. He believed it was roughly about 40,000 residents. What you don't get, though, is you don't get the mode, you don't get the frequency
Yeah, right.
on the amount of fishing that happens. Anecdotally, I did a lot of work in the Head Start community in the early years of Restore the Delta. I talked with lots and lots and lots of moms, and the story I kept hearing over time, this is how the conversation would always go. You know, what's your relationship? What's your interaction with the Delta? And they would look at me and say, where's that? The second thing I would get after that, I would explain to them the water at the end of your street. Oh yeah, I know the water body. Do you do anything there? No, it's polluted. Do you eat fish from there? I don't go fishing, but my uncle brings me fish, and we eat fish from there. And then you would hear how often that would happen. So it really speaks to the need for really just a really broad survey in the region. Anecdotally, again, you can go out on a boat at sunset from the Deepwater Channel in Stockton. I think probably one of the places with some of the worst water quality, and you could just see dozens, maybe up to hundreds of people fishing at sunset. So we really need further studies from this state, really to get a handle on what that fishing population and community is like.
And
Yeah,
I would
so
just add.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Marat. I would just add one last thing, and that is that it is given even the paucity of information available about the activities of people who do subsistence fishing. It's a credit to the state water board and to the regional water boards considering it that they recognize this now as it's officially recognized as a beneficial use in the state of California, and that's an opening by which people can advocate more for its inclusion into protective water quality planning and regulation.
Thank you. So we got a comment from Vanessa Colmar from Fish and Wildlife, and she said that she has seen the same individuals out there daily while sampling, and that daily fishing for food is not uncommon. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that. Yeah, it's interesting.
And then we have one last question, and that is from John Monson. And he asks, if you were addressing the lay public, what would you pitch as the top 3 reasons why they should oppose the tunnel?
I guess, and Barbara, feel free to jump in, because this is a broader policy issue than what our webinar was going to be about. But when we made our case to the water board, we argued strenuously that that the tunnel project at that time, 2018, was a very unreasonable use of water and a very unreasonable method of diversion of water. The method of diversion in particular was very much at the center of testimony that I gave, and I think that's my top 1, 2, and 3 picks. It's unreasonable for several reasons. It takes a large gulp of water. It has the potential to take large gulps of water from the North Sacramento or the North Delta diversions. And as I indicated earlier, that has the level of those diversions potentially reduces fresh inflow to the delta, to the rest of the delta, and that has cascading effects on the potential for harmful algal blooms, the potential for salinity encroachment further up the delta. So, you know, To me, it's the North Delta diversions are the biggest problem with a tunnel project. And of course, you can't have a tunnel project like this without them. I just think that those are an unreasonable method of diversion.
So unreasonable method of diversion ties to the fact that in front of the State Water Board, the proponents of the project, DWR, had approved that they would not harm water users. In lay terms, for everyday people, the reasons to really oppose the project, even still as it stands at the reduced size, is long-term impacts on water quality for the estuary from the amount of water that will be diverted. Cost for California, the construction costs are going to continue to go up at an inflation rate of 5% a year. And in a post-COVID world, why are we going to spend $33 billion on a project that will not make more water? It will just rob one part of the state to put water in another part of the state, and it will decline in what can be sent and what can be sent forward. It doesn't solve any of the problems. And presently, I would say the third reason for really opposing the tunnel is it does not solve any of the issues around flood threat for the Bay Delta area. It doesn't fix our levees. It doesn't strengthen our levees. It doesn't protect the 4 million people who live in the Delta proper, or extension for flooding into the bay side of the estuary. It's just not, it will take up too much money, and it takes too much of the focus from the Department of Water Resources when they could be working on alternatives to actually create greater supply, recycle supply, clean up supply, diversify supply for a lot less money.
Gotcha. And then, so we have one last question, and then I believe we will end this. If there are any other questions after this, please feel free to send them to my email. It's mariah@restorethedelta.org. And just another, you can download this presentation and you can download the notes under the handouts tab, or at the URL that I posted in the chat. And again, if there are any questions, please email me. So the last question comes from Chris Gilbert. He asks, what authority allowed the feds to quote unquote amend the COA so that the CVP got more water and the SWP less? Isn't the COA an agreement between two equal parties, especially given that the water is the quote unquote property of the California public?
I want to say something, Tim, before you give the technical answer, if it's okay. All right. I would change that question a little bit around, and I would say, what gives the state water project and the approval of DWR the authority to give itself less water for people, when water reliability is what they say is their primary concern? Why would you let more water, if you are leading the districts that protect the largest urban population in California, and water is a declining resource, why would you let big agricultural units be able to have access to more of that water while you have less for the people you serve?
One other thing I would add to that, and this actually partly answers Barbara's question, is that a reason that the Bureau and the Central Valley Project were able to, they took a hard line, as I put it in my presentation. You could also argue that they kind of strong-armed the state in this situation, and that is that they have senior water rights in the Delta and along the different river systems where they have reservoirs. Their water rights are senior to the SWP and to DWR. So DWR could have, I'm sure, it put up, a defense of what they were, of the existing coordinated operations agreement, but they were also probably, I surmise, I would read tea leaves to this effect based on my understanding of water rights, and that is that a senior water right holder in the eyes of a judge in court would have a better case to make for why their approach in this competition amidst cooperation would go their way. In other words, the threat of the Bureau suing DWR over water rights if DWR did not kowtow to their insistence in this COA addendum may have kept the state at the negotiating table and willing to accept some changes. It can be argued that maybe some of these changes are kind of around their window dressing or marginal changes around the edges of allocations through the COA, but they're not insignificant in terms when you remember that 1 acre foot is 326,000 gallons of water, and that we're talking about from year to year the allocation of 1 million acre feet. That's 1 million of those units of 326,000 gallons. So it's a lot of water at stake. And so by pressing their legal advantage, and this was part of Ryan Zinke's memo, was that they were going to do legal research and figure out, what options do they have. Well, this was probably one of them. The fact that CVP water rights are senior, especially in the Delta, to those of the State Water Project.
Okay, I think that that's all that we have. Thank you all for joining us today. And like I said before, this has been recorded and it will be up on our website soon. I'll let Barbara and Tim take it off.
Thanks, folks. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good holiday at home, barbecuing in your backyard with your loved ones. Take care.